Lori, they're just connecting to audio now. It's the same phone number next to each other. So probably one got frozen. So I don't know if she heard what you said.
Okay.
Everyone, we're live streaming on YouTube now.
Maybe that's a better way for me to do it. This thing from
Okay, so we're just waiting a few more minutes for a few more people, and then we'll give introductions and welcomes, etc.
I know I did this before. Right? Oh, I know how. Yeah, I go down from here. From here. I got it. Yeah.
And
Oh.
Somebody.
Lori,
Yes.
my screen keeps going black.
Um,
Now
do
it's
you have a
better.
strong internet connection?
Yeah, all the lines are there.
So I see you fine.
Now it's good.
Okay.
Which category is first?
But now it went black.
I wonder if maybe you have low power. Maybe if you plug it in,
Let's
it will
let's
go
what
into
he has.
screensaver mode.
Oh, maybe. I'll sit over here, then I'll try it.
Just based on my own iPad, that usually is what seems to trigger it, is when almost out of power and it's cranky at me.
Oh, it's not. I have 62%.
Yeah, but plug it in anyway.
I'm plugging. Okay, I plugged. Okay, I'll change my seat. Okay. No, it didn't. It's black again.
Try logging out and logging back in.
Arlene, is it possible you're navigating off of your Zoom screen? The Zoom window, if you navigate off, you'll be seeing your background.
I don't see any background.
Yes, that's what the black is. So look for the Zoom icon and go to that window.
No. I don't know how.
Sorry.
We could see you.
I know I could see myself, but I don't see anyone else.
Well, we see you. You don't see a screen? There's no screen
No.
yet, I don't think.
I had it on myself.
Arlene,
lost
maybe
it.
exit out and come back in again.
I just
Oh,
lost
now
it
I see
myself.
it.
Pulling
Yeah,
left,
go
come back.
forward.
Everybody's having trouble.
Hey, everyone, I'm going to mute all of you as our program is about to begin.
Oh,
Lori, you're on mute.
Lori, you need to unmute. Lori, you have to unmute.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. I'm Lori Watson, co-chair of the Racial Justice Task Force of Congregation Beth Heim. We have a few co-sponsors. In addition to, and first of all, I'm pleased to welcome you to our program, which is Once We Were Slaves, Multiracial Jewish Family in Early America with Laura Liebman. The program tonight is sponsored by the Sisterhood and the Racial Justice Task Force of Congregation Beth Chaim, as well as the Ernestine Erkin Social Action Committee of Adith Israel Congregation, the Flemington Jewish Community Center, and the Jewish Center of Princeton. First, a couple of technical points. You will remain muted throughout the program. We encourage you to enter questions in the chat at the bottom of your screen. John Rockhind will be reading them aloud to Laura Liebman during the Q&A. The program is being recorded. If you don't want your face to appear, please turn off your video. We can either send the link to you, or later on you'll be able to just go to Beth Chaim YouTube channel and find it there. And now we will hear a prayer from Rabbi Adina Blum from Congregation Beth Chaim.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. I'm sharing a prayer on behalf of a Jew of color, and I thought that the sentiment was perfect for this week that we honor the life and legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Jr., and tonight where we learn about early Jews of color. That I had never heard this story until I read the article. That was, I think, the impetus for our exploration of tonight's program. O Heavenly Father, bring peace to your people. O Creator of the world, have mercy on Israel. O God Almighty, you are the source of eternal truth and eternal life. We call upon you to have mercy on the people of Israel. O Heavenly Father, we plead with you to bless and protect homeless and displaced people. O God of the prophet Abraham, we ask you to bring an end to racism, discrimination, brutality, prejudice, and hatred. O God of the prophet Moses, have mercy upon the whole world. Bring empowerment to the weak, the poor, and the marginalized. May the God of Israel bless us with acceptance and appreciation for diversity and inclusion of all ethnicities into the nation of Israel. May the source of peace bring peace to the whole world. And together we say, Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Blum, and thank you, Lori. Thank you, Rabbi, for your inspiring prayers over a difficult week. My name is Ellen Chason. I'm past president of Beth Chaim Sisterhood and a member of the Racial Justice Task Force. I would like to welcome you to our racial justice event in honor of Martin Luther King's birthday. Tonight, I will be introducing our speaker, Dr. Laura Arnold Liebman. Dr. Liebman is professor of English and Humanities at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. She has written several books, including The Art of the Jewish Family, The History of Women in Early New York, and 5 Objects, which won 3 National Jewish Book Awards. And also, she's the author of Messianism, Secrecy and Mysticism, A New Interpretation of Early American Jewish Life, which won a Jordan Schnitzer Book Award from the Association of Jewish Studies, as well as a Jewish Book Award. Dr. Liebman also is known for her work as academic director for an Academy Award-winning TV series, American Passages, a Literary Survey. Dr. Liebman was a Fulbright Scholar at the University of Panama and at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. She was a visiting fellow at the Oxford Center for Hebrew and Jewish Studies and at the University of Oxford. In addition, Dr. Liebman was the Leon Levy Foundation Professor of Jewish Material Culture at Bard Graduate Center. Dr. Liebman is currently the Vice President of Publications and a distinguished lecturer for the Association for Jewish Studies. Tonight, Dr. Liebman will be discussing her most recent book, Once We Were Slaves. This book tells the story of a multiracial Jewish family who went from being enslaved people in Barbados to becoming part of New York's elite Sephardic Jewish community. It is now my honor to introduce to you a true scholar, Dr. Laura Arnold Liebman.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share screen, and if for some reason people don't see the images, definitely let me know, as it will make the presentation better to be able to see them. So if for some reason they, let's see if we can get them to move forward. Nope. Okay. We'll try one more time. Oh, there we go. It's moving. Okay, is it moving on your end too? Great. So my story begins not in the Caribbean, where a large part of it will take place, but on the Upper West Side of Manhattan at the beginning of World War II. And it starts with a woman named Blanche Moses, who was the descendant of many famous early American Jews. And she starts us off writing to the rabbi who's in charge of American Jewish Historical Society, asking desperately for his help to find her collection of daguerreotypes, which she had lent to the museum. This collection was important not only because they mattered to Blanche herself and included people such as her uncle, who was a Civil War hero, as well as her mother, who I think often looks a little bit like a Victorian Princess Leia, certainly super charming. But as I mentioned, because she was a descendant of so many important early American Jews that included people, so the reason why she needed the rabbi's help, and I have to say this struck me very differently before the pandemic began, was because, as she noted, she could be reached at any time because she did not go out. And I often thought this was very funny until the pandemic began, and suddenly this letter seemed much more ominous to me recently as I realized, oh wait, I don't go out either. But at the time, I sort of took it as a sign that she had these sort of reclusive activities that were keeping her from going and finding her daguerreotypes herself. So her collection was important in part because she was descended from these really famous early American Jews that included on her mother's side, on her father's side, Isaac Moses, who was a Jew who helped finance the Revolutionary War, and was a very important early member of Congregation Shereth Israel. And on her mother's side included Gershom Mendes Satius, who was the most important early Hazan or rabbi of Congregation Shereth Israel in New York and Congregation Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia. Blanche herself was very much obsessed with genealogy, as many people were, both Jewish and non-Jewish, during this time period. It was a period where there were great amounts of migration to the United States, and one of the ways that Jews who had been in the US for a while showed that they were good patriots was by describing their genealogies and showing how far back they went in the United States history. And Blanche often would write letters to not only the Historical Society, but the New York Times, correcting them on the history of her family's legacy. But when it came to one part of her family, even Blanche drew a blank, and that was trying to figure out who her grandmother, Sarah Brandon Moses's parents were. So she knew one part of it. She knew her father, her great-grandfather, Blanche's great-grandfather and Sarah's father, was a man named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, who had been the most wealthy Jew in Barbados during his lifetime. And she knew that Sarah had a brother that had lived in New York at the end of his life, when, along with Sarah, named Isaac Lopez Brandon. But when it came to figuring out who these siblings' mother was, she was sort of at a loss. She kind of had pieces of information. She thought it was a woman named Sarah Esther, based on the middle name of her son. She thought probably it was Lopez. But unlike everybody else in the family, where she was so brilliant at genealogy, she wasn't ever able to figure out what was the story with her great-grandmother. And it turned out she wasn't alone. The most important genealogist of her day, Malcolm Stern, in terms of Jewish genealogy, also drew a complete blank and couldn't figure out where did Sarah Esther Lopez fit within the family. And it turns out the reason was because Sarah Esther Lopez had grown up in a Sephardic household in Barbados, like Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, but she hadn't grown up in that household as a child of it to the parents of the Lopez family, but rather somebody who was born enslaved to them, as were her two children, Sarah and Isaac. And this was something that was seemingly unfathomable to Blanche, her grandchild, even though she knew that Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, a friend of the Lopez family, had enslaved many people himself. So what I want to do tonight is to go through the story of how is it that Sarah and Isaac began their lives this way, and what can it tell us about the history of Jews in early America. And when you leave tonight, I hope you'll take away at least three things. One would be just something about the story of Sarah and Isaac themselves, because I think their lives are fascinating, and I hope that they'll give you some insights into the complexities of how people lived in early America. The second thing, however, that I hope that you'll take away is something about how race functioned differently, both among Jews and non-Jews during this time period compared to how it functions today. So most of the time when we talk about people such as Sarah and Isaac, their story has been told about passing. So Sarah and Isaac began their lives enslaved in Barbados. By the end of their lives, their race is reassigned and they've become white in New York. But unlike stories of passing, I don't know if people have seen Nella Larsen's the movie version of her book that recently came out. Unlike those kinds of stories, Sarah and Isaac never hid their past. Every single place that they lived, there were people from Barbados who knew that they had began their lives enslaved. In fact, Sarah's future husband actually went to grammar school with the grandchildren of her future enslaver. So it's not as if they're hiding their past. It's just that in each place that they lived, race is understood differently. So I really want us to take away with this concept of what is going on with race during this time period that allows for this kind of flexibility that will disappear within 20 years of them moving to New York. The third thing that I hope people will take away is related to the beautiful prayer that your rabbi began with, which is, how can this help us understand that longer history of multiracial and Jews of color during the longer period of the United States' existence? So I think a lot of us are aware today that there have been a tremendous number of surveys of American Jewish communities that show that American Jewish communities, often somewhere between 9 and 25% of communities, that the people identify as either non-white or multiracial or Jews of color. But a lot of times people think that that history is something fairly recent, something that maybe happened starting in the 1970s. I really want to challenge that tonight and show how that history takes us much further back in time than people have often presumed it did. So in order to get at those three themes, something about Sarah and Isaac, something about race, something about the history of multiracial Jews, I want to go back to where the siblings were born. And that's in the eastern part of the Caribbean and the southern eastern part in the island of Barbados. So I mentioned that we know that their father was a gentleman named Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, and their mother was a woman named Sarah Esther Lopez, though she went by several other names as well. She also went by Esther Gill, and thank goodness when her father died, in his will, he lists all the variety of names that she was known by, which is like a gift to historians everywhere. It's like what you hope to find, that somebody will clarify, is this the same person? Yes, it is. And they were the parents not only of Sarah, as I mentioned, but as her full brother, Isaac Lopez Brandon, and in addition, at least 2 other children who didn't survive to adulthood. Although their father owned several plantations or labor camps on the western part of the island, they did not grow up on one of those plantations. Rather, they, like their mother, were born in Bridgetown, very close to the main synagogue on the island. So they grew up along Swan Street, which you may be able to see very faintly below. It says, or Jew Street, because many Jews lived along that particular street, which was very close to the Nida Israel synagogue. That was a congregation that both their father and the Lopez family that enslaved them belonged to. And in fact, in various points in his life, their father was not just a member of the Ma'amad, the governance board of the synagogue, but in addition was actually the president of that particular congregation. When they lived along Swan Street, however, they weren't enslaved to somebody who was as fabulously wealthy as their father would end up being, but rather to a sort of middle-class Jewish family that lived along this very important commercial avenue in downtown Bridgetown. And most of these houses, which were still in existence in this late 19th century photograph, would have been upstairs in these sort of areas where we see the balconies above a shop that was owned by the family. And in fact, we know that the Lopez family owned two shops along Swan Street. One was a silversmith and goldsmith shop owned by one of the sons of the family that enslaved them. And the other one was a sort of general all goods store. And fortunately, sort of one of these miracles again, that particular shop, the record books from it are still at New York Historical Society. So very precious, as it allowed me to get some evidence about not only who was visiting the shop, but what did the family eat on a weekly basis, which is sort of unimaginable as kinds of evidence to be able to find. So the siblings, when they were born, had one foot in the Jewish community through their father, but because of the way that religion was understood on the island, when it came to make records of their births, their mother took them not to the synagogue, but to the main church in Bridgetown, which is today St. Michael's Cathedral. Then it was just St. Michael's Church. And the reason why she did that was because since she was born enslaved to the family, but not genealogically, her mother had been enslaved and her grandmother had been enslaved, and we don't know how many generations before that, she was not considered legally or halakhically Jewish. So her only option for registering her daughter's birth was to go to the Anglican church, which was nearby. And when she took her there, she had her baptized. That was part of the deal. If you wanted to be registered, you had to be baptized. And this was a really important moment for her for acting out on her daughter's behalf. Sarah Esther Lopez was somebody who never was able to legally marry the man that she lived with. It was not considered something socially acceptable at that time. But by making sure that her daughter was baptized, she held out the promise that someday her daughter would be able to be protected by the church by being able to get married to the man that she had children with. And so that was really important. It turned out Sarah didn't need this because she ended up converting to Judaism, but it was a really crucial step for her mother to take on behalf of her daughter to allow her to have some of the kinds of rights in society that she was not able to achieve during her lifetime. At the same time, becoming baptized meant that she was now under the power of the church. And one of the aspects of that power was that the church not only recorded her name and when she was baptized, but also recorded her daughter's race. So this is the first time Sarah appears in a record, and suddenly her race is being listed as a person of color. And had Sarah stayed on the island for the rest of her life, that race would have followed her and would have been something she could not change. It was the way that race worked in early Barbados was similar to what we would call the one drop rule. If you had any African ancestors, you were a person of color, and that was not something that could be changed either by wealth or by social position on the island. And so, like many of the people born enslaved in and around Bridgetown, the siblings would have continued on in that life as being poor, enslaved, Christian, were it not for two strange and remarkable things that happened in 1801 when Sarah was just 3 years old and her brother was about 11 or 12. And that was that suddenly her grandfather died. And this man who died was not her father's father, but her mother's father, who was also a white gentleman, but not Jewish. It was somebody who belonged to the Anglican Church. And when he died, he had no legitimate children. And unlike most white men in the town who they died would have just left it to their other white relatives, he instead decides to leave both of his houses to the two women and the children that he had by them, who were his children by women of color. And so suddenly, Sarah and Isaac's mother goes from being somebody who was considered property to owning property herself. And this really is just a dramatic and unexpected change for the family to inherit this house, as well as several possessions from their grandfather. The location of that house ended up being very crucial for their merging status as people of color on the island, because it was built next to the old churchyard, where very soon after they inherited the house would be built St. Mary's Church, which was the main church for the elite free people of color on the island, and where many people who had sort of Jewish and African ancestry ended up going to worship. The location of the house was also important because it was right around the corner from where the Methodist Church would be established around the same time. And the Methodist Church here plays a much larger role in this story in some ways than the Anglican Church, even though it's a very minor church on the island. And that's because it turns out that through their mother, this Sarah and Isaac Brandon are related to the most famous woman in early Barbadian history, a woman named Sarah Ann Gill, or Ann Jordan Gill, who was used Methodism in order to gain rights for both the enslaved community on the island as well as free people of color. So for me, this really signals what was so important about how I was trying to think through their history, that I was really trying to pay attention not only to who their Jewish family was, but also the influences of their family who weren't Jewish and how that was impacting the legacy that the family brought forward. Because later, Isaac would become very involved in civil rights activism on the island as well. So just to give you a quick overview of what I'm talking about here, here's Sarah, here's her brother Isaac, here are the two siblings who died as children, here's their father Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, here's their mother Sarah Esther Gill, here's her mother Jemima Lopez, and then I was able to trace it back one more generation to a woman named Deborah, and all of these people were born enslaved to the Lopez family, who are friends of Abraham Rodriguez Brandon. After they gained freedom from the Lopez family, one of their mother's brothers marries this woman, Ann Jordan, who is, again, so important for the civil rights legacy of the island. But in addition, their grandfather had had a couple other families through women of color. And in addition, another one of their aunts was extremely important in that Methodist church. So just to go back really quickly to the Methodist church, one of the things that's so interesting about this family is, and my research into them, is it turns out they were really conduits between the free people of color going to the Methodist church and people who had some Jewish relations who were going to the synagogue. And so we actually see people going back and forth between these two communities. So that's the first big thing that happens in 1801 when they're just children, that they inherit this, their family inherits this house, and suddenly they have the opportunity for some people in the family to become free. The second major thing that really changes their destinies is that in 1801, their father decides that he is going to pay their owner to free his children, and in addition, goes to the Anglican Church and officially has them manumitted. So that means that they are no longer enslaved and their children cannot be enslaved either. And I think it's super crucial to realize how unusual this makes them amongst people in Bridgetown. It's really the vast minority of people who are born enslaved who actually achieve their freedom by being manumitted. And after the manumission, they live on these streets amongst other people who are of partial African and partial Jewish descent, some of whom are enslaved, some of whom aren't. And they probably would have continued their lives in that community, like their aunt, either going to the Methodist church or like other members of their family going to the Anglican church, if it weren't for a strange moment when Sarah is 12 and her brother is 18, when they decide to leave the island and to convert to Judaism. So this is a monumental step. It's one of these moments where Isaac in the records clearly decides he doesn't want to be on the edges of the Jewish community. He doesn't want to live near the Jews, but he wants to spiritually be Jewish himself. They aren't able to convert on the island because basically there aren't any conversions at this point on the island. And instead they travel south to a colony called Suriname. Since today, very few of us probably would go to Suriname to convert, it's probably worth saying, like, why Suriname of all places? So one answer to that is during this time period, both Suriname and some parts of the Dutch West Indies are actually taken over by the British. So it's another British community. The second reason, however, is that Suriname and this little island right here off the coast of Venezuela, Curacao, have the largest Jewish communities in the Americas. So unlike later when New York will take off and be the most important, during this time period, the places with the most moils, the most schools, the largest communities, those are Suriname and Curacao. And you can see it actually looks like Curacao is a little closer, but the reason for going to Suriname is that of those two communities, Suriname also has the largest community of Jews of color in the Americas. And the reason for that is a little bit complicated. That when Suriname was first settled, that most of the Jews were not living up in Paramaribo, the main port, but rather were living downriver in a place called Yoden Savannah, or Jew Savannah. And this was the first semi-autonomous Jewish town in all of the Americas. And when they set it up, the Jews decided, okay, we're going to try and follow all the laws we can. And they set up the synagogue on the highest point on the town. In addition, they laid out the streets. I don't know if people have been to New Haven, but originally New Haven was laid out to mirror the way that the tribes are around the tabernacle. They did the same thing in Yoden Savannah. They're trying to recreate biblical history, to create a new Jerusalem in the Americas. In addition, they decided they were going to try to follow the laws regarding slavery as close to the Bible as possible. And again, this is probably with an eye towards, towards keeping the Bible as closely as they can to bring the Messiah, but also because there are very few Jewish women early on, and they're converting and circumcising children by women of color, such that by the time that Sarah and Isaac arrive in Suriname, scholars have estimated that over half of the Jewish community would have had at least one African ancestor. So a very, very diverse community. By the time that the siblings arrive, most of the Jews have gone back upriver to this main town of Paramaribo, in part because there's been a lot of fights with the Maroons, and who are the people who have escaped from slavery. And there's a lot of damage to the town, and so most Jews have moved north to the main port. When they arrive in that port, they have an option of where they want to convert. And I think this is a really interesting part of their story, and one which also ends up having large ramifications for them later. So this is a very diverse community, as I mentioned, racially, but also economically. The houses along the main wharf were both some of the wealthiest people in the community, but also several different houses owned to take care of the poor. And when the siblings arrive, they decide to associate with the part of the community that are the elite fancy Jews, and that are the Portuguese or Sephardic Jews. So they have a choice of which synagogue to go to, and they very deliberately choose to affiliate with this congregation that reflects their father's ancestry, but also which gives them the most social cachet. For people who've been to the Israel Museum, you may have seen the interior of the synagogue before. It was rented out to the museum in Israel in order to raise funds for the community so that they were able to restore one of the other main synagogues in the town. So when Sarah and Isaac come there, they're able to join the community, able to learn about Judaism, be part of a community that's very diverse. And after asking officially to become Jewish, Isaac is given permission to become circumcised. And then both of them would have gone to this small building behind the fancy synagogue, where below the floorboards was a mikveh, a ritual bath. Today it's very dry, you can see, but it would have been filled with beautiful, clear water. And they would have been able to go in and submerge and then reappear back up the steps, now halakhically Jewish. As I mentioned, this was a large community and they had options of where to go. They could have gone just around the corner to what's seemingly a much bigger building, fancier building, but was actually the synagogue belonging to the Ashkenazi Jews. And at this time period, if somebody from the Sephardic community had married an Ashkenazi Jew, they would have decreased their social status such that they no longer would be allowed to be called up to the Torah, no longer would be able to be sort of a voting member of the congregation. So really important that for this point, they're choosing the better congregation for the position of social status. However, both of these congregations, which were run by Jews who were considered white during this time period, there was also discrimination against those people who had African ancestry. And one of the ways that we see this coming out and playing out in the community is through how marriage is being impacted by local understandings of race. Within Suriname itself, race was much more fluid than it was in Barbados. So you'll remember in Barbados, if you're born a person of color, you will always be a person of color. Not so in Suriname. In Suriname, if you had 7 out of your 8 great-grandparents were European, you could be either white or you could be a person of color. If your parents were legally married in the synagogue or in a church, you were considered white. If they were not, you were considered a person of color. If your parents legally married after you were an adult, which happened to a number of people, then you would cease to be a person of color and would now be reassigned the race of white. So we see even within somebody's lifetime that their race could be changing, even though clearly their genetic makeup has not changed at all. In order to deal with this policy within the larger colony that race was fluid in this way and that race depended upon marriage, we see the Jews in Suriname adapting Jewish traditions in order to address this issue of race. And one of the key places we see that happening are in marriage contracts. So this is a marriage contract of a couple named Ishmael Jadu and Hannah de Matos, and who were married in 1729. And in their ketubah, it marks their race so that the community would know how to understand their children and their grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera. The way that it does that is somewhat unusual. Rather than saying, as it would be the case in many other colonial documents, that they are Cushites or some other biblical tribe mentioned that was from Africa, which is how often people that the Jews didn't like were talked about, they actually refer to them in the Aramaic as emancipated Jews. So this clearly references that they have this legacy in slavery and hints at race, even as it doesn't call them a different race. They're still Jewish, they're just emancipated Jews. For the people who are emancipated Jews, this racial marking would have dire consequences on their ability to succeed in the Jewish community. Within the Jewish community, if you were considered a Jew of color, an emancipated Jew, then you would have to sit in the bad seats in the synagogue. You would be married in the swampy portion of the cemetery. You would not be allowed to be called up to the Torah, and you would not be allowed to vote in synagogue matters. So you really are a second-class member of the congregation, completely not part of Jewish law and completely not legal according to Jewish law, and yet very much the process that worked within the colony. And this marking of race within the Jewish community and the stigmatizing of people who are considered Jews of color can help us understand why it is perhaps that the siblings decided not to stay in this particular colony. In fact, they weren't alone in being irritated at this policy that was created by the European Jews. We know that before the siblings arrived, for a number of years, there was a third congregation called Darhei Yesharim, the Path of the Righteous, and that was located very nearby. And it was a congregation that was not only run for Jews of color, but also by Jews of color. And it had started off as a brotherhood, something which was just to be a place to learn things and to congregate. But eventually they tried to have their own Torah and have their own services. And at that point, the European Jews from the other congregations went to the officials and shut down the congregation and had it disbanded, much to the distress of the members of Darhei Yesharim. So there's a lot of conflict in the community. And we know that at least 6 women from this congregation went and petitioned the administrators of the colonies to try and keep the prejudices of the European Jews from impacting them in this sort of way. By the time that the siblings arrived, the European Jews have shut down Darhei Yesharim, and all the Jews of color have been reintegrated, again, with a lesser status, into those 2 other synagogues that we saw, the Ashkenazi one and the Portuguese synagogue. So at this point, I think really important to recognize, by moving to Suriname, the siblings have had a lot of opportunities that they wouldn't have had in terms of rights of becoming Jewish. But at the same time, because their parents never married while they were in Suriname, they also are considered Jews of color and are being denigrated by the same community. And because of this, potentially, they decide, forget it, we're not staying in Suriname, and they decide to leave. Like it turns out many other members of that congregation. So Isaac decides to go back to Barbados, where he becomes involved in a Jewish civil rights movement, which I won't talk about here, but I talk about a lot in the book, and I'm happy to tell you more about in the question and answer if you'd like. But his sister, who's still a very young child, she's not even 13 yet, decides to travel on, not to Barbados, but to London. And this is something that's financed by her father and allows her the opportunity not only to be part of a much, much larger Jewish community. Her family becomes affiliated with Bevis Marks, the Portuguese synagogue in London, but also to go slightly south of London proper at this time to where there are 2 elite Sephardic boarding schools. These are schools that were not just for the community in London, for the very fancy, wealthy Sephardic Jews, but also drew people from the Sephardic community in the West Indies. So these are people like the Montefiores went here. So suddenly Sarah is in this context where she's meeting all the future leaders of the London Jewish community, people who have ties throughout the Atlantic world. In addition, the boarding school is a place where she's able to learn the Jewish languages that she needs to be an insider within the Sephardic community. So in addition to learning Hebrew, she would have learned Spanish and Portuguese, because those are the languages used in the synagogue, and probably a little bit of French, because that was considered the sign of being somebody who was well educated. She also would have learned how to give charity, as opposed to being the kind of person who would receive charity, and how to run a household with servants, as opposed to being a servant. So in many ways, this education is just as crucial for reshaping who she is and her ability to move into this new world of wealthy Sephardic Jews as that conversion that she had when she was in Suriname. While she is at this boarding school, she has that beautiful little portrait miniature that I showed you at the beginning made. And this miniature is really important for several reasons. One, it's one of the ways that Jews would make marriage partnerships during this time period. Jews are very mobile. You could send your little portrait miniature on ahead of time. But it's also a way that Jews were increasingly asserting themselves as part of the white cosmopolitan society in the Atlantic world. Unlike the large oil paintings, these little ivory miniatures are really a genre of painting that's dedicated to sort of emphasizing the glory of whiteness. And they do this in an important way. One is, you kind of see this a little bit in her portrait. She has this lovely kind of neoclassical look that we might associate with Jane Austen, but at the time is very much associated with classical sculpture. So this is another miniature of a miniature maker. You get a sense of how very, very small these miniatures are. So he's painting in watercolor on the ivory, but you see how the portrait sitters are supposed to be echoing that classical ideal from antiquity. Part of that classical ideal was this idea of what would have been the whiteness of the marble, but here is the whiteness of the ivory itself. So tufts of ivory would have been cut into very, very thin sheets, so thin that you could see through them, and then they would have been ironed so that they had this wonderful sort of warm glow to them. And we can see some of that glow coming forward on Sarah's brother Isaac's miniature. You can see the places where it's not painted. We get this lovely kind of warm ivory color coming through. And when they were made, they would actually put a little sheet often of silver behind the ivory so that you would get the light reflecting backwards. And it's a little hard to tell from these pictures even at close up, but they really are a sort of charming genre in terms of having this kind of glowing appeal to them. And for me, very much about the way race is being constructed in this time period, the sort of emphasis on whiteness as being somehow magical in some certain sense. And we see that kind of emphasis on how you should paint in order to create that kind of glowingness through some of the techniques that people use for getting the paint to stick to ivory. So unfortunately, ivory is very slippery, and in order to get any paint to stick to it at all, they would use this little dot technique called stippling, which you can see happening here, or this kind of hatch marks, which were usually used for background or clothing or hair because it gave this kind of textured look to it, which is appealing for hair or clothing, but not so much for people's actual skin. One of the things that really interests me about Sarah and Isaac's miniature is how it differs from that of other portraits of people of mixed ancestry from this time period. This is a miniature from almost exactly the same time period from early Suriname and one from early New York. And in both of these, we see that the miniature makers are ignoring the advice of miniature making manuals. And instead of using hatching, that kind of scratchy lines for the background or for texture, they're using it on the skin of the women themselves. And this is, in my mind, one of these moments where we see the lens, the racialized lens of the miniature maker coming through. So all of us have a skin color, but here that skin color is being denigrated by the way that they're applying the paint to look like a flaw in the person's skin. And later we'll see miniature makers actually figure out a way to have sort of glowing dark skin. But during this time period, we really see women of color in particular being denigrated through the way that the paint is being applied. Not so for Sarah's miniature, that the miniature maker has followed all the rules that he was supposed to and really allowed that sort of glowing whiteness to come through in her miniature. The other thing that the miniature emphasizes is that Sarah is no longer somebody who has to worry about doing any kind of labor whatsoever. You can imagine this would not be the ideal garment for doing household chores. And in fact, it's one that's associated with emancipation. So it's associated with the Empress Josephine, whose husband Napoleon was very important for Jewish emancipation, but really is seen as a sign of women who don't have to do that kind of labor. Importantly, you'll notice that both Josephine's dress and dresses by other Jews from North America tend to be much lower cut than Sarah's is. And I think this really is part of her West Indian heritage. Within the West Indies, the ability to cover your chest was racialized. So women who had a certain amount of African ancestry were not allowed to cover their breasts and had to leave their chest open, as a way both of denigrating them, but implying that somehow they're sexually available to anybody. So for Sarah to be able to cover herself in this context really is a sign of her privilege as opposed to her necessarily just being modest. So like many miniatures during this time period, her miniature meets another miniature, which is that of a Jewish man who is in London from New York. And his name is Joshua Moses. And while they meet at Bevis Marks, his family is actually not Sephardic. His family, like hers, is a merchant family. His father is Isaac Moses, that man who helped with the Revolutionary War. He's an important merchant in New York. He's also one of the most important Jewish real estate owners in New York. And in that sense, I think we really can see that the marriage between Joshua and Sarah is as much a marriage between those two as between their fathers. So Isaac Moses is becoming, through this marriage, bonded to Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, Sarah's father. And in fact, we see Sarah's father giving her a 10,000 pound dowry in order to make this marriage happen. Just to give you a sense of how much 10,000 pounds buys you during this time period, it's about $30 million worth of purchasing money in today's money. Now, everybody says like, Mr. Darcy has 10,000 pounds a year, and you're like, how much is 10,000 pounds a year? It's a lot of money. So for Joshua Moses, she is just an incredibly wealthy woman compared to anybody he would have ever met who was Jewish in New York. In addition, had they tried to get married at Bevis Marks about 10 or 15 years earlier, they probably would not have been allowed to, not because Sarah wasn't good enough, but because Isaac wasn't good enough. So at Bevis Marks, we see some of that stigmatizing of Ashkenazi Jews. So by marrying her, he's really marrying up in terms of Jewish social status. After they get married, they have a house very close to the synagogue where they live for less than a year before Sarah is pregnant with her first child, and they decide to leave London, since neither of their families lives there, and to travel back across the ocean, not to Barbados, where Sarah would still be considered a woman of color, but rather to New York, where Joshua's family lives. And they settle on the lower end of Manhattan, very close to his father's house and to the synagogue. Let me go back a little bit so you can see better. Here's Sarah and Joshua's house. And then very soon after they've settled there, both Sarah's mother and her brother come up from Barbados. Isaac has been kicked out of the synagogue, not through any fault of his own, but because of discrimination. And he decides to come northward. And he not only becomes business partners with Joshua Moses, with Sarah's husband, but also marries Joshua's sister. And that marriage ends up being crucial for him. The ability to be accepted by one of the major families in New York's really allows him an entree into Jewish society that he could not have had in Barbados. So through that marriage, he becomes a voting member of Congregation Shereth Israel. And in addition, his new in-laws also support him in his bid to become a U.S. citizen, something which typically would have been denied to somebody with African ancestry during this time period. So he becomes a voting citizen of the United States. While they're in New York, they struggle through many things, including a yellow fever epidemic that they barely survive. But in addition, they bring forward a tremendous number of children. So Sarah dies in childbirth around the age of 30, and she's had 10 children before she dies. She has 2 sets of twins, which I think helps explain some of the math of how you have 10 children in such a short amount of time. And of those 10 children, 9 of them survive to be adults. One of them ends up marrying that granddaughter of Gershom Mendes Satius, and he brings forth the vast majority of children that are grandchildren of Sarah, including that woman Blanche that I had mentioned. One of the things that I found so fascinating about Sarah's children was how incredibly mobile they were, just like that previous generation. So I was used to thinking about Jews in the early Atlantic world as moving around because they're merchants, but we really see this carrying forward to the next generation. Some of her sons end up in China for a number of years, involved in trade and textiles. A number of them are Civil War heroes. Some of them end up going to the gold rush to try and strike it rich. Some end up along the Texas border. Some are involved in Mexico in the Mexican-American War, and a couple of them even try and overthrow the government in Nicaragua before coming back to New York and settling there for the rest of their lives. So we really see that opportunities that are created by the previous generation by having access to not just education and money, but also to a certain cachet in terms of Sephardicness and whiteness, allows that next generation a kind of mobility that they might not have had otherwise. In addition to the children that come out of this marriage with Lionel, including Blanche, the woman I began with, and we do have there are a couple of illegitimate children from some of her other sons, but it is mainly through Sarah's family that the rest of the family persists today. Isaac only has one son who survives, and his daughter dies very young. And almost immediately after Isaac dies, he goes and marries the girl next door who's Christian, and he converts to Christianity. So you have this sort of like, after all that work that Isaac did to become part of the Jewish community, his son at least waits till he's dead, but then passes out of the community. But the ties between the parts of the family remain very strong. Sarah's children end up being raised by her sister-in-laws, and those sister-in-laws also help raise Isaac's son, and they are very loving to his descendants, even though they aren't part of the Jewish tradition. So this sort of brings me back then to Blanche, that woman I began with, Sarah's granddaughter, and how is it that by the time that Blanche is trying to figure out the genealogy, she can't get her head around the fact that Sarah Esther Lopez could have been part of a Lopez family, but not born into it. And I think it really helps to understand some of the changes that have happened since Sarah dies in 1828. So one of those is that Blanche never knows her grandmother, so she never grows up hearing that story. Her father was only 3 years old when his mother died, and we don't seem to see anybody in that second generation really talking about the fact that their family had begun their lives in slavery, in spite of the fact that Isaac will go back to Barbados as an adult aunt to do business, and there he's a gentleman of color, and then he'll come back to the US and be white again. So that discussion doesn't seem to make it into that next generation, let alone to Blanche's generation. But I think there's also something important that's changed by the 1920s through 40s, when Blanche is starting to do her genealogy, that also makes it hard for her to understand how she could have had family that began their lives enslaved. So on the one hand, by the 1920s, we start to see the emergence of a lot of different Black synagogues in Harlem, very close to where Blanche is living on the Upper West Side, and including some of the leaders of those congregations are people like Rabbi Ford, whose family, including himself, were from Barbados, and it belonged to the very congregation, that Methodist church, that Blanche's ancestors had helped create, and had been part of that movement back and forth between the Methodist church and the synagogue. So we see that there's all these communities within Harlem that are merging African and Jewish traditions. Yet for Blanche, something radical has happened by the time of the 1920 census. And that is, unlike when her grandmother was first designated white by one of the census takers, and where there's a lot of diversity in terms of how race is defined in different states. So how race is understood in New York and in 1820 is very different than how it's understood, for example, in New Orleans in 1820. By the time that Blanche is starting to do her genealogy, the census has changed, and it is now codified how race should be understood across the United States, and has moved to something similar to what we saw in Barbados with this one drop rule. So for Blanche to have understood her grandmother as having been born enslaved and having had African ancestors is for her to imagine now, according to race laws, that her grandmother was a person of color, according to how race is understood. But it also would be for Blanche to understand herself as a person of color, according to those very same race laws. And that's something we never see Blanche doing. Blanche, throughout her life, keeps marking white on the census. She never has a moment where she rethinks her lineage and her racial understanding of herself. And we can see that happening even in how map makers, this is a map from the 1920s of Manhattan, the parts in red by the map maker are, quote, Jewish neighborhoods where the Jews live. The parts in gray are African-American neighborhoods where African-Americans live. And notice he thinks that those communities are different, right? Like there's no chance that they would be people who had one foot in each of those communities, in spite of the fact that there's these 8 synagogues that are run by and for African-Americans in Harlem. So in that sense, Blanche really is a product of her own era, this moment of rethinking what race means and not understanding those complexities of the past. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take questions from people. Thank you so much for listening to the presentation, and I would love to hear any thoughts that people have or any questions.
Jonathan, you're on mute.
You're muted.
I spoke so much when I was on mute. I apologize. I'm John Rockheim. I'm from Congregation Beth Chaim. I'm moderating the questions and answers. Thank you for those who put the questions in the chat. Please continue to do so, and I will read them out loud. So we have 2 questions so far, 2 great questions. The first one is, when the father of Sarah and Isaac manumitted their children, what was the status of the children's mother? Was she still enslaved even though she was a property owner?
Yeah, so there is this interesting time period where, great question. It appears that she is still enslaved at the moment when they're freed. So there's this, for me, interesting of why he's able to purchase their freedom, but not her freedom. And I assume that's because the woman owning her is not willing to let her go. But we know this because of the status of the other children in the household, that she's not free yet. So she has this weird period where she both owns property, but is a piece of property. We don't know the exact date that she becomes free because there's a lot of records missing from Barbados, but at some point she manages to become free, whether it appears to be slightly before her former owner passes away. So,
do we know when and how and why they first came to Barbados?
Yeah, so that's a great question. No, so I mean, we know sort of generally why Jewish families came to Barbados. Obviously, the enslaved family didn't have a choice, but the Jewish family, both the Lopeses and the Brandons, are very long-standing members of that community. There's an early arrival of Jews from Recife when Recife falls to the Portuguese. Many people know that sort of story. There's the refugees from Recife are trying to get back to Amsterdam. They get captured by pirates or mercenaries and brought up to New York, and that's the start of the New York community. it's also how we see a number of refugees go to other places and start those communities. So Suriname, Curacao, Barbados, a lot of other Caribbean communities have their roots in refugees from Recife. It doesn't appear that those two families came then, but came slightly later, either directly from Iberia to escape the Inquisition, or from going through London first. It's a good question.
So here's a couple of questions about race. Let me start with this one. We've learned from other speakers that at a certain point in US history, Jews were not considered white. Is the difference in this attitude due to the US or to the time period, or what more can you say about that?
Yeah, so this is something that we talk about a lot as scholars about, like, what do we mean by not considered white? Are they like not quite white? Are they like not as fully white, or what does that mean? So here I'm sort of siding with Hasia Diner, who makes an important distinction between how people are being identified on the census. And on the census, Jews are identified as white during this time period, and they are accorded typically certain kinds of civil rights and not others. So that varies tremendously by state up until 1850, whether Jews could vote, whether they could take part in politics. There's just a lot of range of different things, but they are technically white, just sort of not fully enfranchised whites, which is a weird category. But the thing that I think Hasia has pointed out that's really important here is they're not enslavable unless they had African ancestors. And that, for me, is such a crucial mark of whiteness during this time period. Is it somebody who could be legally enslaved or not? And the answer for Jews is, unless you have an African ancestor, you're not enslavable. And for me, that kind of trumps those other issues of, can I vote? Maybe not, but I'm not enslavable, right? So, but it's hard, right? Because we sort of want it to be all one thing or the other, and there's these kind of in-between moments.
So perhaps tied to that question, certainly in a similar category here. This question is about the one drop rule, and it says, I thought that US rules were you had to be 1/4 Black and not one drop to be considered a person of color. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so this is where I think it's really important to sort of think about stages in US laws and census taking about race, and how much they vary over the course of the time period between 1820 and 1920. So in 1820, when Sarah and her brother arrive in New York, there is no set definition of what a person of color is. It varies by state. And in addition, it's a little bit in the eyes of the census takers. So for somebody who's racially ambiguous like Sarah Isaac, it might be easier to be reclassified as white. And we see that throughout different time periods. One of the things that happens around the time of the Civil War is the US starts to codify, what do I mean by race, and to make it more consistent state by state. And then by 1920, they switch over to the one drop rule. So it's really this kind of changing category across the 19th century that gives a sense of why Sarah and Isaac's story has to take place at this moment, as opposed to would have been a very different kind of story even 40 years later, when the race laws are starting to change. It's a really good question, though.
And when Sarah goes to London, is she considered to be white there or a person of color?
Yeah, so that I think is part of what's fascinating, is that London, like early New York, is no like racial utopia, that she gets to New York and she gets reclassified as white, but it's certainly not because there's no racism in early New York, and let alone none in the Jewish community. That there are certainly members of that congregation that are extremely racist, and something similar going on in London. However, unlike the congregation in Suriname, which marked people's race on their marriage contract, her marriage contract only marks her as being a convert. It doesn't mark her as being a person of color, because that's the policy in London at the time, as opposed to in Suriname. So again, we sort of see that she's not hiding her ancestry. There's people from Barbados who are the witnesses to her marriage. So clearly they know the story of why she's converted, but it's not becoming part of the legal record in the same sort of way. And we see this amongst a number of people of mixed African and Jewish descent who come to London during this time period. There's another very famous example from Barbados of a member of the Montefiore family who doesn't convert to Judaism. He's a member of that Anglican church near where the house that they inherited. And he, like Sarah and Isaac, he and his wife are both partially Jewish, part African ancestry, part British ancestry. They're very racially ambiguous. They come to London and they stop being considered people of color and suddenly are able to sort of have some kind of flexibility. Unlike Sarah and Isaac, where everywhere they go, the Jews know what the story is, because he's Anglican, he can just move to a small town and nobody knows the backstory, right? So everybody just assumes things about him. And I think that gets at what makes the Jewish part of the story really interesting, that it's, I would say the Montefiores are passing because they're hiding their background. Sarah and Isaac can't do that kind of hiding. It's much more about, how do I understand what it means to be a Jew? And does Jewishness trump other sorts of ancestry? Or where am I sort of stopping telling stories, and where are stories circulating in the community?
Thank you. So 2 clarification questions. The first one, how do they get their money to buy their freedom?
Yeah, from their father. So their father pays their former owner to have them be freed, and then he also pays their manumission fees at the church. And so the church, for anybody to become free, you have to pay money to the church, because the church by default becomes the place that if they became poor had to take care of anybody who was impoverished. So
a question, if he's a slave, how did he get the money?
Their father is not enslaved. Their father is actually quite wealthy, that he's Sephardic. Does that make sense?
I think so.
I can't hear you.
I think that makes sense.
Okay. I see something talking up at the top, but I can't. Linda, I see you talking, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, Linda's the one who asked the question.
Okay.
And Linda, you can type in the chat if you have a follow-up question.
Either I misheard you, or I thought their father was a slave and he paid for their freedom.
No, so their father was born free. Their father is
so they become
all of European ancestry. It's their mother who's born enslaved. So like in the US, your whether you're enslaved or not follows your mother's lineage.
Okay, sorry about that, guys.
No, totally fine. Sorry, that wasn't clear.
So another clarification question is, did they speak Spanish or Ladino? And my follow-up question is, what is Ladino?
Yeah, so Ladino is a Judeo-Spanish, which is very, it's kind of like a fossilized Renaissance Spanish that then travels with Jews who are kicked out of Iberia to the Ottoman Empire, which at that point is not only sort of Greece and Turkey, but goes all the way, through Palestine, all the way through North Africa. And so that language then takes on loan words from local languages. So the Ladino varies by location. So like I took Ladino classes from a Moroccan rabbi, but we would use a Turkish book and he'd be like, that's not a word, because it was a Turkish loan word. So, it varies by place. But Ladino is something we associate with Jews who are Eastern Sephardic Jews, Jews from the Ottoman Empire, Jews who are those Portuguese Jews like Sarah and Isaac's family. They actually use Spanish and Portuguese rather than Ladino. So they're using a much more modern kind of Baroque Spanish. The Spanish is what they would use in the prayer books, and then the sermons would often be given in Portuguese.
And can you talk a little bit more about what prompted Sarah and Isaac to convert to Judaism? Was there, for example, an advantage over being Christian when it came to things like property, or what exactly spurred that decision?
Yeah, so I would say there's a big disadvantage to becoming Jewish during this time period in Barbados. So in Barbados, and this is why Isaac gets involved in the civil rights movement, that um, Jews cannot vote in Barbados when at the time that they convert, and they cannot take part in government. The only people who can do that are Anglicans, and only Anglicans who are white, male, and have a certain amount of property. So Isaac becomes part of the struggle to get the synagogue recategorized as what's called a vestry, which is what you need to be part of in order to vote. And since the Anglicans had the monopoly on vestries before that, only they could vote. So it's kind of a loophole of like, instead of converting, why don't we just change the name of the synagogue? And then I could vote. So they, there's disadvantages to becoming Jewish, I would say, over becoming Christian, but kind of a non-issue in that people of color can't vote during this time period either. So, so disadvantages, but for Isaac, not as much, maybe. Both the Barbadian records and the records from Suriname indicate that he converted for spiritual reasons, that he wanted to be Jewish. So that seems to be what they're saying is the motivation. Presumably, you know, I would assume either explicitly or implicitly there's some pressure from his father, perhaps, you know, that his father seems very, very interested in the children, bringing forward his legacy. And we see that both in his will, but also in the amount of money that he puts into Sarah's marriage, that he wants those descendants. He doesn't have any legal children from, he never marries, so he doesn't have any legal descendants. And really becoming Jewish is a way of becoming close to him too.
So that ties into this question here. You talk a little bit more about why was their mother not considered Jewish? Or who was in this case?
Yeah, so I think here we know her, we don't know who her her great grandfather was, so it's possible that she also has Sephardic ancestry or Jewish ancestry from her mother's side, but for their mother, but she's not considered Jewish because on the island, being Jewish follows the mother, right? And so since the maternal line has always been following slavery, that she has never been perceived as being Jewish in that community. Something I didn't talk about in this presentation, but I find important and interesting is that the area that her family is from in Africa is an area that we know has this oral tradition and strong tradition, even down to today, as having people being one of the lost tribes and being part of the Jewish people. And I, fortunately, since I've connected with a number of the descendants, their DNA tests show that that's what part of Africa the family is from too. So we don't know whether the enslaved people came to the Americas with a sense of being Jewish, but they're certainly from that same part of Africa.
So I wanted to ask about the descendants. Thank you for mentioning that. You've been in contact. Can you talk a little bit about what they're doing today, or?
Yeah. So some of the first descendant I sort of found by being a little bit sneaky, that he had written a letter to the Barbadian Historical Society, and this is like a note to people: if you ever send anything to an archive, a letter, be prepared for them to keep it, right? So I went to the archive, and it was his letter about, can you tell me information was in with the family found? I was like, well, that's interesting. And so I was like, did my internet search and was able to track him down and met up with him, and he wanted to meet at the St. Nicholas Society, which is in the same building in New York, or was at the time, as like Daughters of the American Revolution. I thought, oh, this conversation is going to go weird, right? But he was so sweet and so excited because his son was involved in civil rights law, and this like created this whole understanding of his past that he didn't have. So it was very lovely in encountering him. And then since then, I've connected with other descendants, both on Isaac. He was a descendant of Isaac. I've met some of Sarah's descendants as well. And so some of them have been just really generous with sharing things that came down through their part of the family. And I've also been able to share with them things that they didn't know about. So I had mentioned, for example, that the family stayed close. It was a story the family had that once Isaac's son married out, that they had been sort of cast aside by the rest of the family. And it turned out that wasn't the case, that the will showed that this very close and loving connection between the parts of the family. So I think that was sort of reassuring in a way, like, oh, they drifted apart, but it wasn't that they were, excommunicated or something.
And with the descendants that you've spoken with, do they consider themselves to be Jewish? Do they consider themselves Jews of color? What's their identity sense?
I mean, I don't know if the story has sort of changed their perception of themselves at all, but I think we think about race kind of differently than we did in the 1920s. So my guess is, who knows? But Isaac's only son converted to Episcopalianism and actually became very prominent. I have some lovely pictures of their house off of the park, and they had lots of mansions and whatnot, but they stayed Christian on that side of the family. Sarah's descendants through that son Lionel and Selena Satius, the Princess Leia woman, they stayed Jewish, and some of them converted later, but mostly stayed Jewish on that side of the family.
And another contemporary question. I should mention, thank you, Dr. Liebman, for your time. Questions are now flying fast and furious. It's fantastic. As long as you can, please, your patience for answering, and please continue to add more questions. But another contemporary one, can you describe today's Jewish communities in Barbados and Suriname?
Yeah, so very different from each other. So the Barbadian community very much collapsed by the 1930s, and they actually sold the synagogue, and most of the Jews had left the island by that point. It was reinvigorated during very shortly thereafter by refugees from the Holocaust. And there's actually a gentleman sent me a book that he had collected of oral tradition from those refugees from the Holocaust and their descendants, and that's a large part of the community today. So mainly Ashkenazi, and beautiful, beautiful book. I wish that I had it here to show you. But so that community is largely Ashkenazi, and they have done just an incredible job of stewardship of the tradition of the island. So they have put a huge amount of money into like maintaining the synagogue, getting back the synagogue, maintaining the synagogue, doing restoration. There's a beautiful visitor center. There's a museum. They did archaeological work and found this beautiful ritual bath. Really just sort of a great example of people embracing a legacy that they've become part of much more recently. The community in Suriname was much more stable for longer, up until about the 1970s, when Suriname became independent from the Netherlands, and there was a period of sort of instability politically, and many of the Jews in the community left either for Israel and made Aliyah or went back to the Netherlands. And that community has continued to be very diverse today, and you'll find people from that community now in the Netherlands leading services in the Esnoga, the Portuguese synagogue there. So continues. It's built back a little bit since things have stabilized, but definitely like you still see a lot of that diversity going on today in terms of the community.
Great. So that leads to another question. We have a few questions about you and your work. Did you travel to the various places you talk about for your research?
Yeah, so I have been, this is where having had the leisure, I guess, or the needing to take so long to write the book helped, that it took me about 10 years to do the research for this book, and it definitely builds off of a lot of the work they had done for my earlier books. But I went to archives in Barbados several times because I had been working in Barbados before. I went to Suriname and worked there. I was on a Fulbright in the Netherlands, so I did work there. When I was in London working at Oxford, I did research in England for a lot of time. So I definitely both had the privilege to be able to travel to different archives and tried to take advantage of any time I'm at an archive for some other reason to sort of try and look up information about them.
So I do have a few more questions about your work, but I have to say that there's still more questions about Abraham too. So let me go to one more about him, and then we'll turn to some questions about you. So according to this questioner, it's surprising that Abraham never married. Wouldn't that have been unusual for an affluent Jewish man? Was he able to legitimize Sarah and Isaac as well as Manumitted?
Yeah, so I would say I would agree with you that I think it's a little surprising that he never marries, that he has two very long-term relationships that produce children, that after Sarah and Isaac's mother, Esther Gill, dies, he takes up with another woman in Barbados and has a bunch of children by her, and I've talked to a bunch of their descendants as well. And it is surprising to me that he chooses not to marry. Either it's not so surprising he doesn't choose to marry the women that he's involved with because of how race works on the island at the time, but it's surprising to me that he doesn't marry in addition to having women that he keeps as mistresses. So that is interesting, that choice on his part. I've forgotten, sorry, the second part of the question about that.
So the second part of the question was he able to legitimize Sarah and Isaac as well as Manumitted?
Legally, no. So legally, they still are his, quote, natural children when they're referred to in legal documents. But I would say there's many ways in which he circumvents that by giving them privileges that they otherwise wouldn't have. So when he gives his daughter a 10,000 pound dowry and then writes in his will like where it's going to go to, there's a way in which he's building her into his family, right? Like that shows everybody that she matters to him and they're connected. And he does similar things when Sarah and Joshua come back from London. Right before they arrive, he buys one of those big, beautiful brass lamps that hangs in the synagogue. He buys one of those for the synagogue. So he's definitely like kind of showing his relationship to them constantly in ways that will help them be more socially successful.
Great. So let me ask two more questions and then we'll stop here. And both are about yourself. So the first one is, how did you come to pursue this project and write about this family?
Yeah, great question. So as is sort of clear, I've been working on Jews in early America for a long time. I had begun my career as an early Americanist, but working on Native American communities in colonial New England. So for me, there's a way in which this story was an interesting return to some of the issues that I actually dealt with in my first book, which was on Wampanoags and Martha's Vineyard, and that it was trying to think about like how do race and religion intersect and how are those categories not as distinct as we might think of them as being today. So that definitely like was part of what was interesting to me about their family. That said, I will say there's a way in which both being interested in their story but having the miniatures of them made a big difference to me.
Those miniatures are something else, I gotta say.
Miniatures are something else, you know, like as somebody who works on an art and material culture, the miniatures as a genre, I think people kind of notice they have these big eyes, and that's part of the genre of miniatures is those bigger than life eyes, and they're meant to draw you in. And I do feel like they work, right? Like we still feel that sense of like being compelled by their personalities even after all this time. And so I'm not sure if I would have been like so interested in continuing to follow up on them constantly, like over so many years, if I hadn't originally had those images sort of pulling me into their story.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, it's the past version of Instagram filters, right?
Yes, totally. Yes.
So one final question here, and that is, what are your views on how we should apply this story to today?
Great question, and thank you for whoever asked that. For me, their story is really powerful in a number of ways. One is really, I think that story of resistance and rebellion that we constantly see through the communities of color fighting back against the injustices, both in the Jewish world and the larger world of the colonies, that I think for me that's really a powerful part of this, of that thinking about how to nurture and give voice to those sorts of parts of our community of people seeking power and not backing down in the face of adversity. So for me, that's one really important part of it. And maybe the other one also is kind of the downside of that, which is really to think about the ways in which the communities in the past were inclusive, like allowing people to become part of the community, and then very exclusive. And the ways in which we don't want to model that part of the past, right? Like that we want to think in terms of racial justice going forward, what can we learn from the mistakes of the past about failures in being inclusive in the way that we would want to be welcoming to people? And in that sense, I think, there is a sort of painful side to Sarah's re-education, right? That in order to become accepted into the community, she has to code switch and learn how to speak the way they speak, and to dress the way they dress, and to behave the way that she's supposed to behave. And that's a kind of loss of self too, right? Or a denial of self. And I think for me, remembering it's not just a good thing to become educated, but can be really painful to unintentionally put those kind of burdens on particular people in communities to not be allowed to be their authentic selves. We don't want to do that, right? Like that we want to figure out ways that we can allow our Jewish communities to be multitudinous enough to have people have their feet in both worlds and be authentic to both of those places. So
Oh, that was a wonderful answer and wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have a few other thank yous that I want to do, but obviously everybody can unmute here, applaud Dr. Liebman in such a very powerful, very interesting, and very powerful presentation there. Her book, as you might remember from the beginning, is Once We Were Slaves, The Extraordinary Journey of a Multiracial Jewish Family. It's available in bookstores. I checked it on Amazon while we were talking. And since I'm a big fan of the libraries, I should say that they are available at the local libraries here as well. I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Ernestine Erkin Social Action Committee of Addith Israel Congregation, and its Rabbi Benjamin Adler, who we'll hear from in just a moment here, Rabbi Eric Cohen and John Fellon at the Flemington Jewish Community Center, and Linda Oppenheim and Stacy Gould from the Jewish Center of Princeton. From our congregation here at Beth Chaim, I'd like to thank Mindy Lippman, our sisterhood president. She co-sponsored the event with the Beth Chaim Racial Justice Task Force. Our task force was developed by our terrific rabbi, Adina Bloom, who you heard when she gave the opening prayer. And of course, you can find her every Friday night Shabbat here at our synagogue, and also on our YouTube channel, which is the Beth Chaim channel on YouTube. The Racial Justice Task Force is chaired by Lori Watson and myself. You heard Lori in the beginning here. But we really have to give a big thank you to Lori for doing all of the hard work and putting this program together. I want to thank two other members of our task force specifically, Mark Perkis, who masterfully led our media outreach campaign that many of you were able to see and led to 87 people joining us today. And Ellen Chasen, who introduced Laura and brought Laura and her work to the congregation, who inspired us to do this event and was essential in this programming. Many thanks also, as always, goes to Ann Berman-Waldorf, who's our fantastic director of lifelong education and who does that and so much more. And Mira Bizovsky, our executive director, who runs things behind the scene here. The Beth Chaim Racial Justice Task Force has a website. It's www.bethchaim.org/racialjustice. If you go there, you'll see many resources and also many recipes from around the world. We hope to see you again at a future event. And now I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Adler for a closing blessing.
Thank you so much. This has been a really fascinating presentation, and really learned so much this evening, and I hope everyone did as well. Our Torah portion that we'll be reading this coming weekend, this Shabbat, is Parshat Yitro, which is about the giving of the Torah. And according to Jewish tradition, we all were at Mount Sinai together receiving the Torah. Every generation, generations past, generations present, generations future. And I think this presentation tonight gives us a different sense of that legend. And I just imagine what it would be like to see all of that, to see the diversity of who we are as a Jewish people, the different backgrounds that we have, the different cultures, the different languages that we've spoken and continue to speak. That diversity makes us a strong people, a united people. It actually, I think it divides us, but actually strengthens us. And so I wanted to read a prayer by Alden Salavi called Bechol Lashon, in every tongue, in every language, which I think speaks to the diversity of the Jewish people, but at the same time, our unity. We sing praises Bechol Lashon, in every tongue, in every voice, in joy and sadness, with music and with love. We seek truth Bechol Lashon, in every tongue, with every breath, in study and prayer, with faith and with purpose. We pursue justice Bechol Lashon, in every tongue, in every land, in word and deed, with strength and with courage. We study Torah Bechol Lashon, in every tongue, in every generation, in wonder and awe, with zest and with zeal. We are one people present on Sinai, where God spoke Bechol Lashon, in every tongue, to every soul, to every heart, the whole house of Israel. Amen. Thank you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful night.
Thank you.